Hi, and welcome to question 6 of the Leaving Cert Ordinary Level 2025 Paper 2. So we'll get stuck in, and this question is on statistics. So we'll read through. Very important to read these questions carefully, especially with a kind of maybe outside the box question like this. It can be a little bit tricky. If you know your stuff, it's not too bad. It's a short question, but that doesn't change the fact that it's awkward. So this is a 10C question. Okay, so let's try to get the low partial if we can. Part one is the 10C, part two and three have 10 marks, but they're marked together. So the read through, the marks in an exam were normally distributed. That's important. Okay. It means that the data is the same on both sides or can be estimated to be the same on both sides. So there's a whole range of statistical techniques that come into play in a normal distribution. So as shown in the diagram below. The mean mark was 62. Now the mean is represented by this middle line, and in a perfectly normally distributed set of data, the mean, mode, and median would be the same number. If it's skewed right or left, you might have the mean being larger or smaller than the median and the mode. It just depends on the spread of the data. The standard deviation, so the deviation away from the mean, was 14. Now, part one says use the empirical rule to answer parts A1, A2, A3. And part one specifically states use the mean and standard deviation to fill in the numbers along the horizontal axis on the diagram below. So if we realize that the mean is the middle value, well, that's our first thing. Okay. We're given 90 here on the end, but we'll worry about that in a second. Okay. The mean is the middle value in a normal distribution. So that's 62, and that gives me the low partial. Okay. Now moving on from that, these different lines here are representing the standard deviation. So in a normal distribution, this might be one standard deviation from the middle. Okay, so plus one standard deviation and then negative one. And this would correspond to 68% of the data. Now, once you go into two standard deviations, it represents like 95% of the data. And then there's the three standard deviations, like off over here, will be almost everybody, like in around 97.5% of the data. So if we add on the standard deviation, which we were told was 14, so 62 plus 14 gives 76. That's our top value here. Then the mean take away the standard deviation of 14. So 62 take away 14 is 48. Then we're already given the standard deviation of 90, which is 62 plus 14 plus 14. And then the lower extremities, you're taking away two standard deviations. So 62 take away 14, take away another 14, leaves you with 34. And that's the question. So not too bad if you remember that little fact, but if you don't, it can be awkward. But at least try for the low partial. And if you remember that, even just taking a guess, if that's what has to happen, you know, it would be logical if you know anything about the mean that it's the middle of the data. Now, with clarification that not all data sets are the same. Now, part two and three, which are marked together, part two says a student is chosen at random, which is kind of going into probability. Find the probability that this student had a mark between 34 and 90. Now, the empirical rule kind of states that 95% of the data is within two standard deviations of the mean. Now, the empirical rule means that if you're within two standard deviations of the mean, you're between 34 and 90 based on your previous work. Okay, 34 and 90 are within that range. Now, they're at the edges of that range, but they're still within the range, and that's the 95%. So again, this question is tricky because you kind of have to have an understanding of the empirical rule. Okay. Now, really quoting anything from this, if you kind of recognize that 34 and 90, if you said like strong probability or something, maybe that would show some understanding of the empirical rule, but they might be looking for something maybe more exact. Now, for the part three says 150 students at the exam. Estimate the number of students who got marks between 48 and 70. Okay. Now, that's between 48 and 70 would be just somewhere in here. That's within one standard deviation of the mean, which is 68% of the data. That's what the empirical rule states. So if we have 150 students, okay, it's just a matter of getting what's 68% of that. So you're multiplying by 68 over 100, or use the calculator button, and I got an answer of 102 students. And that's it. Now that part there might be a little bit easier than the part two. It just depends on where your knowledge sits at the time of the exam. Okay, so the next part then, part B, which is a 10 marker. And I find these particularly tricky. It says then Owen writes down 5 positive whole numbers from smallest to largest. For these 5 numbers, it says the median is 9, the mode is 6, the range is 11, the mean is 10. Find the 5 numbers that Owen writes down. Now it's a 10 scale, so getting the low partial of 3 could be fairly achievable. Really, the range is the biggest value, take away the lowest value. If you pick any 2 numbers that subtract to give 11, you have definitely got the low partial. Okay. If you can get more than one thing correct, like for example, the median is the middle value. Okay, so this value here has to be 9. I think that's how I approach it here in the answer. Okay, there's multiple different answers for this, so just messing with the numbers, you'll eventually get to a point where you have maybe more than 2 or 3 items correct, and you're up maybe here at the mid to high partial. Okay, so the first one then is, well, the median is the middle value, and that is 9. We were told it's 9, so we can put that right bang in the middle. Now, the next thing we were told is that the mode, okay, is the most common number. We're told that it's 6. Now, there has to be there more than once, or else there's no mode. So this would have to be 6 and 6. Okay, now I didn't use my animations right. 11 is the range, so it's the difference between smallest and largest. So I wonder if the lowest number is 16, what would be 16 plus 11? Give 17, and reverse that. 17 minus 6 is 11. Now what I'm missing here is the mean, and the mean is when you add all the numbers together and you divide by how many numbers there are, that will give you the mean. Now if you test it out, you know the answer. If you add 17 and 9 and 6 and 6 and something and divide it by 5, you could just test this on the calculator, just throw in different numbers. You know it has to be bigger than 9 and less than 17. So try 10, 11, 12. Just backspace on the calculator and replace that number. You'll eventually get to a point where the answer is 10. And that for me was 12. And that's it. Tricky enough question. I found my head just so many things going on that I can struggle with these questions. Didn't think this one was too bad in fairness, but like I have came across these before, so I have a little bit of an advantage in that regard. Right, so that's the end of question 6. As always, if you want a copy of these notes, send me an email to shanetroy@gmail.com. Like and subscribe to get access to more playlists. Best of luck.